Catherine, we are delighted that we have an official title for you now, Director of Diversity, but of course our partnership has gone on for so long. When did you actually start working with us? Do you remember
roughly?
Date?
I remember roughly, I think, but it was probably close to nearly 14 years ago when in fact the programs first started running the symposium. So I just got a call. I was at the Financial Review writing the Corporate Woman column, and I got a call asking me if I'd be interested in coming and speaking at some of the symposiums around Australia. And I remember at the time being quite astonished because I'd done very, very little public speaking. I'd had a couple of invitations on the back of the column, but that was really interesting. And that in fact, I took that up and I did speak at a number of them that year, and then in subsequent years did more. So yes, it's been a long association.
And what have you noticed in that time? I often joke that we actually had a program that we were teaching women how to assert themselves and sound like everybody else around the table. That was short-lived, thank goodness, but it was very much around that timing. What have you noticed in terms of changes over the time?
Look, I think the changes I've noticed have been similar to the changes I noticed during the period I wrote the Corporate Woman column at the Financial Review, which went back quite a lot earlier than the talk started for you. But I think what I noticed is it moved, the whole sort of debate moved and changed. It became more sophisticated, but it was also about dealing with covert rather than overt discrimination. So of course, over the last 20 years, for example, we've seen a lot of legislation and a lot more awareness rising. Unfortunately, it hasn't been matched by an increase in the statistics, in improved statistics of women in leadership and narrowing the gender pay gap and so on. But it has become there's much more awareness, and I think there's been much more overt work within organisations. So in the early days, people would be talking about, being sacked for requesting flexibility, or when they announced they were pregnant, classic maternity discrimination. I think we saw less of that. And as you say, I think in the early days, these kinds of programs were often about kind of remedial advice for women, how to lower your voice, have more sort of assertiveness training and so on. And I think that's shifted, as you say. I'm very grateful it has. So, and that's been matched, of course, by more women, slowly but surely, moving into the workplace, but also moving up in the workplace. So by no means as many as there should be, but certainly more there. And I think the old excuses about we don't have enough women, we don't have enough experienced women, have worn very thin. So I think the focus is on other areas and less on remedial, and more about let's diagnose what we can change in the system, the rules and the attitudes that we have to cope with.
We were very excited when you launched Stop Fixing Women, and you spoke about it at quite a few of our events. I think we even ran panel sessions this year around it as well. What it really stood out though is that focus on what we can do about the system. When we run our leadership programs, we still hear from so many women about the challenge around confidence. And from your sage words and the research that you've done, we try not to lean in to talk about fixing that issue, but more generally. What sort of advice do you give around that?
Well, I think we look at this the wrong way around. I think lack of confidence has been seen as a cause of women's lack of representation and lack of progress. I think it's a symptom. So I want to flip the thinking around. We have no biology or neuroscience to show us that women are born lacking in confidence compared to men. That is, in fact, what gets reflected back to them, particularly in formal workplaces all the time. It's not an even playing field. Their work and their endeavours and the results they have do not get greeted in the same way as their male colleagues. So I think it's important that we understand that this is not something that they're born with, that it is a symptom. And often enough, what we're talking about as lack of confidence is coping mechanisms for women in very difficult environments. And I think that once that changes, and again, the research would back this up, organisations that have more women in management, right up to the top, have far less problem with getting women to put their hands up for promotions, for example. So once you change the environment, then that confidence seems to magically improve. So I don't think it is about some sort of innate lack or deficit. It is definitely about the environment they're in. So therefore, I think a lot of the advice has been a bit faulty and has unfortunately embedded an insecurity in women, which is all too easy to trigger because, as I say, the way that their efforts are greeted. So I really think we've got to stop talking about it as though it's something that they bring as a deficit to the workplace and look at it the other way around.
It took us to a different place. In 2018, we launched 100 Days for Change, which you know about, and that was an opportunity to create more of a systemic focus and to really encourage organisations and individuals to take on more of a proactive approach. And within that, we heard there was a really strong theme about the language change, that women and men were starting to sort of realise that it wasn't helpful, whether it was with their children or their children's school or the boardroom or their meetings, to actually be aware of their language. And I'm keen to hear what you've noticed in terms of the stereotype bias that actually happens is attached to the language, but also the focus on creating a broader conversation within that space too.
Well, I think it's, yes, I think it's changed. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the change, I think, at times when we talk about language can be a bit superficial. I think there is more sensitivity to how we speak about some of these issues. But I think that's a bit of box ticking, actually. I think, I wish it was matched by more action, in fact, and progress that we could see and measure. So more accountability, in fact. What still amazes me, and I think we have wonderful data that we capture in Australia through the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. They've done some wonderful work. They've toolkits around things like the gender pay gap. One of the things that their latest report has said is that 40% of employers reporting into the agency are now conducting gender pay gap audits, but only 40% of the 40% are doing anything about it. And I think this is the problem. The rhetoric is there, but the action isn't. And I'm surprised by how many corporate leaders that I meet who tell me rather proudly that they've instigated a new recruitment regime, so they have women on interviewing panels, or they've done something around gender pay, they've brought in an audit, and I say, what's the result of that? What have you done because of that? And they look at me quite blankly, because they haven't really done anything. They've ticked the box to do some of the data gathering, but they haven't then applied it. So I think that, yes, we have a different conversation, and that's very good. We have pockets of activity, which are really welcome, but I don't see the systemic changes. So I think we need to do more in that area and actually make sure that we're aiming for a result and that we're tracking it, which is why I'm a great believer in targets, for example, because I think you actually have to have a framework there. Otherwise, there's a lot of activity, but no results.
And how can we support the organisations that are actually doing some good work, but also a little bit floundering? We had quite a few come to us to say, through this 100 days, tell us what others are doing. We're working, whether it's on the flexibility focus or the pay gap, but we know that there are other components that we're not getting right, or we're frustrated because of the lack of progress. And there was a sense of they're feeling very isolated and fatigued by it. And how can we support the organisations, but even more so, I suppose, the individuals?
Yeah. Well, I think that maybe it's setting practical goals. So yes, I understand what you're saying. Some are finding that they're making a little progress in certain pockets, but that's good. I think that the idea that you can do everything and do it all at the same time is probably impractical. So I think I quoted in the book an academic from Stanford who talks about small wins, small things and steps that you can take that are really helpful. I think another thing I'd be a great advocate of is most organisations of any decent size in Australia have a women's network of some kind within them. I think tapping into the wisdom and listening, genuinely listening to what women are experiencing and the solutions they're often coming up with for themselves is actually a really practical way of making some progress. So actually maybe investing in, putting a little bit more a company investment into those women's networks instead of expecting women to do them on top of their day job, and actually hearing them, listening to them, asking them what would work, what would help them, I think is a really practical way to start. I do understand the gender fatigue side of things, but I actually think that there's so many areas that they can look at. Maybe the answer, in fact, is to start by phasing and doing a couple of things, seeing if you get some results, and then moving on. And also, there's no perfect formula here. If there was, everyone would have adopted it and we wouldn't have a problem anymore. So I think each organisation will find that there are different challenges that they'll be facing. But one of the things we also know now is from groups like Male Champions of Change and so on, is that people coming together to compare notes on some of this can be enormously helpful and practical. So I do think it's getting that back up and that renewal and that energy from finding that somebody else has done something, it did work, here's how they went about it, let's try something like that ourselves.
We find that when women come together for our events or our programs, it's very reassuring when they hear exactly what you're saying, that it's others are facing the same challenges, or that they're not actually as bad as they realise the progress. But also what we hear is that we need others in the room. The ones that are in the room are those that converted. They're the ones that know that there's an issue. And the challenge that keeps coming up is, how do you engage others in this conversation, or actually see it as a priority that needs to be attended to, that aren't as willing to be part of?
Well, I suppose that's true, although I've often heard that about audiences of women at various forums, that you're preaching to the converted. I'm not quite sure that's the case, actually. I think a lot of women coming along to these forums are actually finding the whole thing quite perplexing as well. Not quite sure which way to turn, what would be the most useful use of their time and energy. So I think it's actually incredibly useful to them. But I do take your point, if they want to spread the word. I think that you have to work with whatever allies that you can find. And I think it's easy to, and quite understandable to find that you might find yourself feeling very isolated, particularly with your male colleagues. But I suspect if you think about it and really look at what people's interests are and so on, you will find that there are people who are sympathetic. Building a coalition is really important in an organisation, and I think that actually that's the way to go about it. One of the best pieces of advice I think you can give to women who are feeling isolated is build up a posse, a group around you, especially if you want to raise these issues. Don't do it on your own. Find women, like-minded women, maybe not in your immediate team or even in your area, but go and find others and find if you can go together as a group. I think it helps enormously. It gives credibility, because we're still at a point, sadly, where one woman's voice is not heeded. So I think it is helpful, and of course, if you can get male allies to go with you, even better. So I think it is a question of doing that. A lot of people say you've got to build the business case, but we've done that. We've done it for many, many years. So I think it's actually, the business case is well known. I think what we're after in this space is not so much innovation, it's intention, finding the people who have a real intention to change and working on them. So I think that is possible. I'm not saying it's necessarily easy, but I do think that you can work that out and use whatever networks you have to find like-minded people who can go with you to try and get that message through.
Another challenge or focus that we often find comes through our programs is taking away or redirecting some of the conversation from being a woman's problem. That it's only about women. It's women that have to drive it. It's women that have to forge ahead. That it's all about, whether it's the woman or the mother often, it's a parenting focus. How do you think it's important to take that focus out totally, or do we need to contextualise it? Where do you see we need to go?
Well, it is annoying when we talk about gender in the workplace, and it always ends up by default being a women's issue, because men have a gender too, actually. And when people say, people should be appointed on merit, not gender, I always say, absolutely right. So why are so many appointments made to men? Because that's a gender issue, right? So, but you're quite right. On the other hand, one of the things I've been hearing a bit more lately, it comes and goes, but I've been hearing in discussions and panels that I've been moderating, someone in the audience was saying, we shouldn't talk about gender, it's about diversity of thought or diversity on a broader canvas. Now, I don't think any of those things cancel each other out. I think we can work on all of them, and in fact, all of them benefit. But telling women to go to the back of the queue worries me. Women make up 51% of the population. If we can't get it right for that many people, well-educated people in our country, then really we've got a problem. So I don't think one is more important than the other, but I do think if we're going to seriously address the homogeneity of particularly the upper ranks of many of our organisations, we do have to talk about gender, because there are specifics around sexism and bias that are very much about women. And once we make some progress on that, I think we will find a whole lot of other areas that we would now lump together under the diversity term will actually, they won't be solved, but I think we can address them with a great deal more confidence. I think it will change.
One of the real focus, I suppose, and the reason why 100 Days for Change became timely for us was because we noticed that there was more conversations around, the Me Too arena, and there was an appetite for change as well, but in perhaps more of a positive direction as well, and trying to get the balance. We need to have both as well. What have you noticed in terms of the Me Too advocacy, the movement, and how that has supported or moved us in a direction?
I think the Me Too movement's been incredibly important for women globally, clearly. Sadly, we had to have thousands upon tens of thousands of women speak up before they were taken seriously about sexual harassment, much of it in the workplace. But what I think it showed was women collectively could have a very affirming experience and change the dynamics. Now, there's no doubt there's been repercussions from the Me Too movement, which are regrettable, and there's still much of that to play out, and we're seeing some of that in Australia at the moment. But what I would say is, while the research shows a lot of people are not even aware of Me Too, there's a significant number of people who are, a lot who aren't. I can assure you that every employer of a reasonably sized organisation in this country has heard of Me Too. It is now on the agenda. How it's dealt with, of course, is a very different thing. I mean, what we should be looking at now is prevention in the future. But I also have heard from so many women in so many different workplaces that they're being listened to. It's a shame that it had to be on the back of such appalling testimony, but sometimes that's the way change happens. You have a burning platform, the risk from the Me Too movement and Me Too allegations is significant, and I think organisations are looking at that. I am really optimistic that in the future it will become less of a, oh goodness, we've got a scandal, and more of a, how can we prevent this in the future? How can we have better gender equity in our workplaces so these things don't happen anymore? Because it is about power imbalances and gender. So I'm actually optimistic about the future. The other thing about Me Too is it hasn't disappeared. And many people thought it might. So a good year on from that global spread of that campaign, we're still talking about it. And as I say, there are some very ugly side effects of it, but I do think it's shown women that standing up shoulder to shoulder has been very powerful. And we saw that only recently in Canberra, where women in the LNP stood up for each other and said no more bullying and harassment. And I think some of those things are well overdue. And I think there's a very positive message coming out of that, including for younger women.
Catherine, we've been working with each other for many years through Women in Leadership Australia, and it's been such a pleasure. And now we've formalised it with the role Director of Diversity. Why now is this important for you to be working with us in this space?
Well, it's a great pleasure to be working with you, Suzi. And as you say, we have been working together for many years. In a way, I see it as a formalising of an informal relationship that we've had for a long time. But why I think it's important now, after having an association with you for such a long period, is I can really sense momentum has been building. The last series of symposiums were really amazing. A huge amount of energy in the room, and I think that the work that the organisation's done over the decade and a half that it's been running them is really paying off, and I can really see the quality of the audiences and the speakers has improved, and I think there's a real energy there. And I think the timing on a much broader canvas is fantastic as well. I think, as I say, women are finding their voices through a whole lot of areas. I think the debate's much more sophisticated, and I think when women come together to discuss these issues, it improves their lives, but it improves their workplaces, and it makes our chances of progress so much greater. So I'm an optimist about it, and I think joining forces means that that momentum will just be greater and continue to flow.
And I say watch this space. We've got a lot of great work to do together. Thank you so much, Catherine.
Thank you.